Subscribe now and press the bell icon so you never miss an emotional story that touches your heart. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace. Thomas Mitchell stood perfectly still at his post. His red uniform pressed to perfection, his tall bearskin hat sitting proudly on his head. He had been a royal guard for 7 years now, and he took immense pride in his duty. Every morning, he woke up before dawn, polished his boots until they shined like mirrors, and prepared himself mentally for another day of service to the crown. Thomas was different from many other guards. He came from a small village in Yorkshire, where his father had worked in the coal mines his entire life. His mother cleaned houses to make extra money for the family. They never had much, but they had love and respect for one another. When Thomas told his parents he wanted to join the military, his father's eyes had filled with tears of pride. Now, standing outside one of the most famous buildings in the world, Thomas often thought about how far he had come from that tiny village. The tourists started arriving early that morning. It was summer, and London was filled with visitors from all corners of the world. They came with their cameras, their guidebooks, and their excitement. Thomas had learned to tune out the noise. He stood motionless, eyes forward, breathing steady. Some tourists would wave at him, trying to make him smile or react. Others would pose next to him for photographs. A few would even try to talk to him, asking questions he could never answer while on duty. Thomas remained like a statue through it all. Among the crowd that morning was a young man named Jake Peterson. Jake was 23 years old, visiting London from California with his friends. He had a camera in one hand and a water bottle in the other. Jake was the kind of person who loved attention. Back home, he had a social media account where he posted videos of pranks and stunts. His followers loved watching him do outrageous things, and the more shocking the content, the more likes and views he received. Jake lived for those moments when a video went viral. His friends gathered around him near the palace gates. They were laughing and pointing at the guards, making jokes about how they never moved. One of his friends, Marcus, dared Jake to do something funny. Jake's eyes lit up with mischief. He'd been planning this moment since they arrived in London. He wanted to create content that would get millions of views, something nobody had done before. He pulled out his phone and handed it to Marcus, telling him to start recording. Thomas noticed the group of young men approaching. He had seen hundreds of groups like this before. Usually, they just took photos and moved on. But something about this group felt different. The way they were whispering and looking at each other made Thomas slightly uneasy. Still, he maintained his position, eyes forward, body rigid. Jake walked closer to Thomas, his water bottle now openly visible. The other tourists nearby started to notice what was happening. Some pulled out their phones, sensing that something interesting was about to occur. Marcus held the phone steady, making sure to capture everything. Jake stood right in front of Thomas now, so close that Thomas could see the smirk on his face. Without warning, Jake unscrewed the cap of his water bottle. In one quick motion, he threw the entire contents directly at Thomas's face. Cold water splashed across Thomas's cheeks, dripped down his uniform, and soaked into his bearskin hat. The water ran down his neck and seeped into his perfectly pressed red jacket. Gasps echoed through the crowd. Some people laughed. Others looked shocked and uncomfortable. Marcus kept filming, zooming in on Thomas's wet face. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Thomas felt the cold water running down his skin. He felt the weight of his soaked uniform. He felt the humiliation burning in his chest. But more than anything, he felt a deep, overwhelming sadness. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to make him break his composure, but this felt different. This felt cruel. Jake stepped back, laughing loudly. His friends joined in, high-fiving each other and checking the video to make sure they got it all on camera. Jake shouted something about how this was going to break the internet. He could already imagine the views, the comments, the fame. This was exactly what he wanted. Thomas remained still. Water continued to drip from his chin onto his uniform. His eyes stayed forward, but inside, a storm was raging. He thought about his father, who had taught him dignity and honor. He thought about his mother, who had always told him to treat others with kindness. He thought about the oath he had taken when he became a royal guard, the promise to serve with discipline and grace no matter what happened. The crowd around them had grown larger. Some tourists were recording the aftermath on their phones. Others were whispering to each other, debating whether what they just witnessed was funny or wrong. A few people looked genuinely upset, shaking their heads in disapproval. But Jake didn't care. He was too busy celebrating his successful prank. What Jake didn't know was that Thomas Mitchell was not just any guard. Behind that uniform was a man with a story, a man who had overcome poverty and hardship to stand where he stood today. Behind that stoic face was someone who understood sacrifice and service. Behind those steady eyes was a human being with feelings, with dignity, with a family who loved him. As the water slowly dried on Thomas's face, something inside him shifted. He made a decision in that moment, a decision that would change everything. He would not let this moment define him as a victim. He would not let this tourist's cruelty go unanswered. But his response would not be what anyone expected. It would not be anger or revenge. It would be something far more powerful. The sun continued to rise over Buckingham Palace, and Thomas Mitchell continued to stand at his post, wet and humiliated, but not broken. What happened next would teach Jake Peterson a lesson he would never forget, and it would touch the hearts of millions of people around the world. The crowd slowly began to disperse after Jake's prank. Most tourists moved on to take more pictures of the palace, already forgetting what they had witnessed. But a few people stayed, watching Thomas with concern in their eyes. An elderly woman from Germany stood nearby with her husband, both of them looking disturbed by what had happened. A young girl holding her mother's hand pointed at Thomas and asked why the man had water on his face. Her mother quickly pulled her away, not wanting to explain the cruelty she had just seen. Thomas remained at his post, his uniform clinging uncomfortably to his skin. The summer heat would help dry his clothes, but the damage to his dignity felt harder to repair. He focused on his breathing, a technique he had learned during his military training. Breathe in for 4 counts, hold for 4 counts, breathe out for 4 counts. This helped him stay calm during difficult moments. Jake and his friends walked away from the palace, still laughing and replaying the video. Marcus uploaded it immediately to Jake's social media account with a caption that read, "Royal Guard gets soaked. His reaction is priceless." Within minutes, the video started getting views. People commented with laughing emojis. Some called Jake a legend. Others said they wished they had thought of doing something like that. The video was spreading fast, and Jake couldn't have been happier. What Jake didn't realize was that not everyone found his prank amusing. Among the people who had witnessed the incident was Sarah Thornton, a journalist for a respected London newspaper. She had been at the palace doing research for a story about tourism when she saw everything happen. Sarah felt sick to her stomach watching that young man humiliate the guard. She quickly took out her notebook and started writing down what she had witnessed. She also recorded a short video on her phone, capturing the aftermath of the prank. Back at his post, Thomas heard footsteps approaching. He couldn't turn his head to look, but from the corner of his eye, he saw his commanding officer, Captain Robert Hayes. The captain stopped beside Thomas, standing at attention for a moment before speaking in a low voice. "Mitchell, I saw what happened. Your relief will be here in 10 minutes. Report to my office after you change into dry clothes." Thomas wanted to respond, to say something, but his duty required silence. He simply blinked once to acknowledge the order. Captain Hayes walked away, his face stern but his eyes showing a hint of sympathy. Those 10 minutes felt like hours. Thomas's mind raced with thoughts. Would he be reprimanded for getting water thrown on him? Would this incident be reported? Would his family hear about it? His mother worried about him enough already. The last thing he wanted was for her to see her son being humiliated on the internet. Finally, his relief arrived. Another guard named David stepped into position, and Thomas was free to leave his post. He walked through the palace corridors with as much dignity as he could manage, his wet uniform leaving small puddles on the floor. Other guards and staff members saw him and immediately understood something had happened. Some offered sympathetic looks. Others pretended not to notice. In the changing room, Thomas peeled off his wet uniform. He looked at himself in the mirror. His face was red, partly from the sun and partly from the embarrassment he felt. He changed into a dry uniform and tried to compose himself before heading to Captain Hayes' office. Captain Hayes sat behind his desk, his fingers pressed together in front of his face. He gestured for Thomas to sit down. The office was quiet except for the ticking of an old clock on the wall. "Tell me what happened, Mitchell." Thomas explained the incident, keeping his voice steady and professional. He described the group of tourists, the water bottle, and how he maintained his position despite the provocation. Captain Hayes listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When Thomas finished, the captain leaned back in his chair and sighed deeply. "You handled yourself well out there. Many men would have broken their stance. You honored your duty in the uniform, even when someone tried to make a mockery of it." Thomas felt a small sense of relief, but Captain Hayes wasn't finished. "However, this incident raises concerns. That tourist violated multiple regulations. Security footage captured everything. We have clear images of his face and his friends. The palace security team is already reviewing the footage." Captain Hayes pulled out his phone and showed Thomas something that made his heart sink. Jake's video was already circulating online. It had thousands of views and was being shared rapidly across different platforms. The comments section was a mix of people laughing and people expressing outrage. "The world is watching now, Mitchell. How we respond to this will matter. Not just for you, but for every guard who stands at these posts." Thomas felt a knot forming in his stomach. He had never wanted this kind of attention. He just wanted to do his job with honor and go home to his quiet life. Now he was becoming an unwitting internet sensation for all the wrong reasons, Captain. Hayes closed his phone and looked directly at Thomas. "I want you to know that you have the full support of this command. We will not let this incident define you or diminish the respect owed to the Royal Guard. But I also want to ask you something important." Thomas sat up straighter, waiting. "If you could respond to that young man? If you had the chance to say something to him, what would it be?" The question caught Thomas off guard. He had spent the last hour trying not to think about Jake, trying not to feel angry or hurt. But now, being asked directly, emotions he had been suppressing began to surface. "Sir, I would want him to understand what this uniform means. I would want him to know about the men and women who wear it, who serve their country with pride. I would want him to see us as human beings, not as objects for entertainment." Captain Hayes nodded slowly, a small smile appearing on his face. "That's exactly what I hoped you would say. Thomas, what happened to you today was wrong. But I believe something good can come from this. Sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty is not anger but truth." Thomas wasn't sure what his captain meant, but he trusted him. Captain Hayes had been in the military for over 30 years and had seen countless situations. If he believed something positive could emerge from this humiliation, Thomas wanted to believe it too. "Go home, Mitchell. Take the rest of the day off. We'll handle the security matter with the tourist. But I want you to think about your story, about why you became a guard, about what this duty means to you. We may need you to share that story very soon." Thomas left the office feeling confused but slightly hopeful. As he walked out of the palace, he noticed people staring at him differently. Some had seen the video. He could tell by the way they looked at him with pity or curiosity. He kept his head high and walked to the train station. Thomas arrived at his small apartment in East London. He lived alone in a one-bedroom flat that he kept spotlessly clean. Military discipline had taught him order and structure. He made himself a cup of tea and sat on his worn sofa, finally allowing himself to process what had happened. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends and fellow guards who had seen the video. He ignored them all. Meanwhile, Jake and his friends sat in a pub celebrating their viral success. The video had reached over 100,000 views in just a few hours. Jake's follower count was climbing rapidly. Brands were already reaching out to him for potential collaborations. He felt like he had hit the jackpot. "Man, this is insane. We're going to be famous." Marcus shouted over the noise of the pub. Jake raised his glass, grinning widely. He refreshed his phone again, watching the numbers climb. The attention felt intoxicating. He had dreamed of going viral, and now it was actually happening. He didn't think about the guard whose day he had ruined. He didn't consider that the person behind that uniform had feelings, a family, a life. To Jake, the guard was just a prop in his performance, but not everyone saw it that way. Sarah Thornton, the journalist who had witnessed the incident, was back at her newspaper office writing a story. She had done some research on Royal Guards, learning about their training, their dedication, and the strict code of conduct they followed. She discovered that many guards came from working-class backgrounds, viewing military service as a path to honor and stability. Her article was taking shape, and she knew it would be powerful. That evening, Thomas's mother called him from Yorkshire. She had somehow heard about the incident from a neighbor whose grandson had sent her the video. Thomas could hear the worry in her voice. "Tommy, are you all right? That video that boy posted, is that really you?" Thomas closed his eyes. He hated that his mother had to see that. "Yes, Mom. It's me. But I'm fine, really. It was just water." His mother was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke with the fierce protectiveness that only a mother can have. "That boy should be ashamed of himself. You stand there with such pride serving your country, and he treats you like that. It's disgraceful. Please don't worry. The palace is handling it. I just want to forget about it and move on." But his mother wasn't ready to let it go. "Your father would have been so angry if he had seen that. You know, he was always so proud of you. When he was sick in the hospital, all he talked about was his son. The Royal Guard. He told every nurse, every doctor, anyone who would listen." Thomas felt tears stinging his eyes. His father had passed away 2 years earlier from lung disease, a consequence of decades working in the mines. Thomas had been by his bedside, wearing his uniform because his father had asked to see him in it one last time.
I know.
"Ma'am, I think about him every day when I put on this uniform." They talked for a while longer before saying goodbye. After hanging up, Thomas sat in silence, thinking about his father's words. "Tommy, when you wear that uniform, you represent something bigger than yourself. You represent honor, duty, and service. Never forget that." The next morning, Sarah Thornton's article was published. The headline read, "The Human Behind the Uniform. Royal Guard humiliated by tourist prank deserves our respect." Not ridicule. The article went into detail about what had happened. But more importantly, it talked about who Royal Guards really were. Sarah had interviewed former guards, military historians, and even Thomas's commanding officer, Captain Hayes. The article described the rigorous training guards endured, the discipline required to stand motionless for hours in all weather conditions, and the deep sense of duty that motivated them. Captain Hayes had shared information about Thomas without using his full name, explaining that he came from a humble background and had worked incredibly hard to earn his position. The article painted a picture of dedication and service that many people had never considered. Social media exploded after the article was published. The narrative began to shift dramatically. People who had initially laughed at the video started feeling guilty. Comments on Jake's post changed from amusement to criticism. People called him disrespectful, cruel, and immature. They pointed out that the guard was just doing his job and deserved basic human decency. Jake woke up to find his phone flooded with notifications, but they weren't the kind he wanted. Instead of praise, people were condemning him. His video was still going viral, but now for completely different reasons. He was being called a bully, a disgrace, and worse. News outlets were picking up the story, not to celebrate his prank, but to criticize it. Jake felt his stomach drop as he read through the comments. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to be the hero of his own story, not the villain. His friends tried to reassure him that it would blow over. But Jake could see concern in their eyes, too. At the palace, Captain Hayes called Thomas into his office again. This time, the captain was smiling. "Have you seen the article, Mitchell?" Thomas shook his head. He had deliberately avoided looking at his phone or computer. Captain Hayes showed him Sarah's article on his tablet. Thomas read through it slowly, his eyes widening. The article was beautiful. It captured everything he felt about his service, but could never articulate. It made him feel seen and valued in a way he hadn't expected. "The public response has been overwhelming," Captain Hayes continued. "People are outraged by what happened to you. They're expressing enormous support for the Royal Guard. The palace has received thousands of messages of support. The tourist who threw water on you is facing serious consequences. Thomas felt a mix of emotions. He was grateful for the support, but he didn't enjoy being at the center of such attention. "Sir, what kind of consequences?" Palace security identified him and his friends. They've been banned from all royal properties indefinitely. Additionally, the Metropolitan Police are considering charges for assault and public disorder. The young man's visa situation is also being reviewed. Thomas felt uncomfortable. He hadn't wanted to ruin anyone's life. He just wanted respect. "Sir, I appreciate the support, but I don't want anyone's life destroyed over this. I just want it to be understood that we're human beings doing an important job." Captain Hayes looked at Thomas with deep respect. "That's exactly the kind of character I expected from you, Mitchell. And that brings me to why I called you here. We've been contacted by several media outlets who want to interview you. The palace typically doesn't allow guards to speak publicly, but in this case, we think it might be beneficial. We want to give you the opportunity to tell your story in your own words." Public speaking terrified him. He was trained to stand silent, not to address cameras and reporters. "I don't know if I can do that, sir." Captain Hayes leaned forward. "Mitchell, you've already shown incredible courage. Standing at that post after being humiliated took strength. Now I'm asking you to show a different kind of courage. Help people understand what this uniform means. Not for revenge against that tourist, but to honor every guard who has ever stood at these posts." Thomas thought about his father. He thought about all the guards he served alongside. He thought about the young people who might be considering military service and needed to see that it was a noble path. "I'll do it, sir." The interview was scheduled for the following afternoon. Thomas barely slept that night. He kept rehearsing what he might say, worrying about how he would come across on camera. He had never been comfortable with attention. Even as a child, he preferred staying in the background, letting others take the spotlight. But now, circumstances had thrust him into a position where his voice could make a difference. The morning of the interview, Thomas put on his civilian clothes, a simple button-down shirt and trousers. Captain Hayes had advised him to appear as himself, not in uniform. The interview would take place in a quiet room at a hotel near the palace. The journalist conducting it was Sarah Thornton, the woman who had written the article that changed everything. Thomas felt grateful that someone who already understood the situation would be asking the questions. When Thomas arrived at the hotel, he was greeted by Sarah and a small film crew. Sarah shook his hand warmly and thanked him for agreeing to speak publicly. She explained that the interview would be recorded and released online. With portions potentially appearing on television news programs, Thomas felt his palms sweating. They sat in two comfortable chairs facing each other, with cameras positioned at different angles. A technician attached a small microphone to Thomas's shirt. The bright lights made him squint. Sarah gave him a reassuring smile. "Just speak from the heart, Thomas. Tell your truth. That's all anyone wants to hear." The cameras started rolling. Sarah began with simple questions about his background, his childhood in Yorkshire, and his decision to join the military. Thomas spoke slowly at first, his voice uncertain. But as he talked about his father and mother, about growing up with very little, but never feeling poor in spirit, his voice gained strength. "My dad worked in the coal mines his whole life. It was hard, dangerous work. He came home every day covered in black dust, exhausted to his bones, but he never complained. He taught me that honest work, no matter what kind, has dignity. When I told him I wanted to serve in the Royal Guard, he cried, not because he was sad, but because he was proud." Sarah listened intently, occasionally nodding. She asked about his training, the discipline required, and what it felt like to stand at his post. "People see us standing there, and they think it must be easy. They think we're just statues, but we're human beings. We feel the cold in winter and the heat in summer. Our legs ache, our backs hurt. We think about our families, our worries, our hopes, but we've been trained to put all of that aside and focus on our duty. It's not about being emotionless. It's about having enough discipline to not let emotions control us." Then Sarah asked about the incident. Thomas took a deep breath before answering. "When that water hit my face, my first feeling was shock. Then came embarrassment. All those people watching, cameras recording. I felt humiliated. But underneath that, I felt sad. Sad that someone could treat another human being that way just for entertainment. I wasn't angry at him personally. I was disappointed that he saw me as an object, not as a person. Sarah leaned forward slightly. What would you want that young man to know if he's watching this? Thomas paused, gathering his thoughts carefully. I'd want him to know that I forgive him. I don't hold hatred in my heart. But I'd also want him to understand that actions have consequences. Not just legal ones, but emotional ones. When you hurt someone for a laugh, for views, for fame, you're diminishing both them and yourself. Real strength isn't in making others look foolish. Real strength is in lifting others up, in showing kindness, in recognizing the humanity in everyone you meet. The interview continued for another hour. Thomas talked about what the uniform meant to him, about the responsibility he felt representing the crown and country. He spoke about his fellow guards, many of whom came from similar backgrounds, all striving to serve with honor. By the end, Thomas felt emotionally drained, but also strangely liberated. He had spoken his truth. The interview was posted online that evening. Within hours, it had millions of views. People were moved by Thomas's sincerity, his humility, and his grace. Comments poured in from around the world. Veterans thanked him for representing military service so well. Parents said they would show the video to their children as an example of character and dignity. Even people who had initially laughed at the prank video apologized in the comments. Jake saw the interview in his hotel room. His flight back to California was scheduled for the next morning. He watched Thomas speak with growing discomfort. Hearing the guard's voice, seeing his face without the ceremonial uniform, made everything real in a way it hadn't been before. This wasn't just a character in a funny video. This was a real person with a real life, real feelings, and a real family. Jake's girlfriend had broken up with him that morning over the phone. She said she couldn't be with someone who would do something so cruel for attention. Several of his sponsors had dropped him, not wanting their brands associated with his behavior. His social media accounts were still flooded with negative comments. Jake felt his world crumbling around him. His friend Marcus knocked on his door. When Jake let him in, Marcus looked serious, and I just watched that guard's interview. I feel terrible. We really messed up. Jake nodded, unable to speak. He felt a lump in his throat. What are we going to do? Marcus asked. Jake thought about this question for a long time. What could he do? An apology video would seem insincere, just another attempt to salvage his reputation. Deleting the original video wouldn't undo the harm. Money or gifts would feel hollow. Jake realized that there was no easy fix for what he had done. Back in London, Thomas returned to duty the next day. When he arrived at the palace, something unexpected happened. As he walked to his post, other guards saluted him with extra sharpness. Palace staff members stopped to shake his hand. Even some officials he had never spoken to before offered words of support. When Thomas took his position at the gate, all tourists approached differently. Instead of trying to make him react, they stood at a respectful distance. Parents explained to their children who the guards were and why they deserved respect. Many people simply said thank you as they passed by. Some left flowers at the gate with notes expressing appreciation for his service. One elderly man, a veteran himself, stood at attention in front of Thomas and saluted him. Tears ran down the old man's weathered cheeks. Thank you for your service, son. You've done us all proud. Thomas felt his own eyes burning with emotion, but he maintained his composure. That moment meant more to him than anything else that had happened. At the American Embassy in London, officials were dealing with a complicated situation. Jake's behavior had created a diplomatic headache. The British government had expressed displeasure at his actions. There were discussions about whether criminal charges would be pursued. Jake's parents had hired a lawyer and were desperately trying to mitigate the consequences. Jake sat in the embassy waiting room, feeling smaller than he had ever felt in his life. His viral fame had become viral infamy. He thought about what Thomas had said in the interview about actions having consequences. Jake was learning that lesson the hard way. That evening, Thomas called his mother. She had watched the interview and had cried through most of it. I'm so proud of you, Tommy. Your father would have been bursting with pride. You spoke so beautifully, so honestly. You've honored our family and everyone who wears that uniform. Thomas felt peace settling over him. The incident that had caused him such pain had transformed into something meaningful. He had found his voice and used it to speak for those who couldn't. He had turned humiliation into education, cruelty into compassion. 3 days after Thomas Mitchell's interview aired, Palace Communications office delivered an unexpected message. Someone wanted to meet him privately. Arriving in his dress uniform, Thomas was surprised to find Jake Peterson sitting at a conference table, head in hands, with a palace official and lawyer present. Jake looked broken pale, red-eyed, completely unlike the confident young man from days before. The official explained that Jake had requested this meeting to apologize directly, emphasizing that Thomas had no obligation to accept or even stay. Their eyes met for the first time since the incident. Thomas nodded and agreed to remain. When they were left alone, heavy silence filled the room until Jake's shaking voice broke through. "I don't even know where to start. I'm sorry feels so inadequate for what I did to you." He explained how watching Thomas's interview had opened his eyes to a devastating truth. He had never seen Thomas as a real person, just content for views and likes. He hadn't considered who Thomas was, what he felt, or what the uniform represented. Jake's voice cracked as he continued. His entire life had been spent chasing attention in the social media age, learning that outrageous behavior earned notice. He'd mistaken that for success and happiness. Now everything had collapsed. He'd lost his girlfriend, sponsors, most friends, and his parents' respect. Legal charges loomed. But what hurt most was knowing he'd hurt someone undeserving. "You were just doing your job, serving your country, and I treated you like a joke," through tears. Jake acknowledged that sorry wasn't enough, but he needed Thomas to know he finally saw the person behind the uniform. He expressed genuine, deep remorse for his actions. Thomas sat quietly, reflecting on his father's teachings and mother's kindness, the values that shaped him. "I appreciate you saying that," he finally responded. "It takes courage to face someone you've wronged and admit your mistakes. A lot of people never do that." Thomas revealed that when Jake threw water on him, he'd felt not just humiliation, but sadness, recognizing that someone who humiliates others for attention is likely suffering internally. "You're chasing the wrong things," Thomas explained. "Views, likes, fame, they're all empty if they're built on hurting others. Real respect comes from how you treat people, especially when there's nothing to gain from it." Then Thomas offered something remarkable. "I forgive you, Jake. I forgave you even before this meeting. Holding on to anger would only hurt me, not you." However, he emphasized that forgiveness didn't eliminate consequences. Jake needed to learn and grow from this experience. The wrongdoing didn't have to define him forever. He could choose to use whatever platform remained to spread kindness instead of cruelty, to see people as human beings rather than content. For another hour, they talked deeply. Jake shared his upbringing, the pressure to constantly entertain, and how hollow viral success had felt even before everything collapsed. Thomas discussed choosing service over selfishness and finding purpose beyond himself. When they stood to leave, Jake extended his hand. Thomas shook it firmly. "Thank you for seeing something in me worth saving." "Even after what I did," Jake said quietly. After Jake departed, Thomas remained alone, feeling lighter, as if extending forgiveness had released an unexpected weight. The next day, Jake posted an unprecedented video. Simple, sincere, with no music or editing tricks. He explained and apologized for his cruel, disrespectful actions, acknowledging it wasn't just a prank, but bullying that degraded another human being. He described meeting Thomas, who showed him undeserved grace and forgiveness. Teaching him what real strength looked like, Jake announced he was removing all prank videos and stepping away from social media to discover who he wanted to be. "I'm done chasing views at the expense of human dignity," he declared, apologizing to followers for setting a terrible example. The video ended simply the most honest thing Jake had ever posted. Responses were mixed, but Jake wasn't seeking validation anymore. He was doing what was right. Back in California, Jake's parents suggested he return home, enroll in community college, and find regular work to figure out what he truly wanted from life. For the first time in years, Jake felt relieved at the prospect of being ordinary, of not constantly performing for an audience. Meanwhile, Thomas's life slowly normalized, though permanently changed. Schools invited him to speak about service and character. Military recruitment increased, with many citing Thomas's interview as inspiration. The palace received donations to military charities in his name. One afternoon, Thomas received a handwritten letter from Jake, working at his uncle's construction company. Jake found the honest hard work was teaching him what chasing internet fame never had. He thought often about their conversation and Thomas's words about choosing who to be. Now volunteering at a youth center, Jake talked to kids about social media validation dangers, telling them about Thomas and real character. He didn't expect friendship or anything else. He simply wanted Thomas to know their meeting had changed his life. The mercy Thomas showed was a gift Jake would spend his life trying to deserve. Thomas carefully folded the letter, hoping Jake would stay on this better path. Redemption was possible for anyone willing to do the work. Months passed. The viral video faded as news stories captured attention. Thomas continued his palace duties, eventually receiving a commendation for his conduct. His commanding officer mentioned consideration for promotion one cold November morning at his post. A 7-year-old boy approached with his father and gave Thomas a small salute. "My son wanted to salute you," the father explained. "We watched your interview together. You helped him understand what service means." Despite the cold air, warmth spread through Thomas's chest. This was why he wore the uniform, what his father meant about representing something bigger than yourself. Watching them walk away, Thomas reflected on the journey from humiliating moment to proud one. Pain had transformed into purpose. Cruelty sparked compassion. One young man's worst moment became a teaching moment for millions. The morning sun rose over Buckingham Palace, casting golden light across the courtyard. Thomas stood motionless at his post, a guardian of tradition, a symbol of duty and proof that dignity could triumph over disrespect. He had weathered the storm and emerged stronger, forgiven without forgetting the lesson, spoken his truth and changed hearts. Thomas Mitchell was more than a royal guard. He was a reminder that how we respond to cruelty defines us more than the cruelty itself. Standing proud in his uniform, Thomas knew his father was looking down with pride. 2 years had passed since the incident that momentarily made Thomas Mitchell famous. The Royal Guard had been promoted to corporal and now trained new recruits, teaching them not just physical requirements, but the mental and emotional strength needed to serve with dignity. Many young soldiers told him they had joined because of his interview. The viral video still existed online, but its meaning had transformed. No longer just a prank video, it had become a case study in schools and universities discussing cyberbullying, viral content consequences, and the importance of respect. Psychology professors analyzed it. Ethics teachers used it in lessons. What Jake had intended as entertainment had become education. Thomas's personal life had also changed. He had met Emma, a primary school teacher in South London, at a charity event for veterans. She had approached to thank him for his service and tell him she used his story in her classroom to teach students about character and courage. They talked for hours, and friendship slowly grew into something deeper. Emma understood his job's demands and respected his dedication. She made him laugh and reminded him that life was about more than duty. It was also about joy. One Saturday morning, Thomas and Emma were having breakfast at a small Covent Garden cafe when a young man approached their table. Thomas looked up, shocked to recognize Jake Peterson. Jake looked different, healthier, with clear eyes and a genuine smile. "Thomas, I'm sorry to interrupt. I saw you sitting here and couldn't walk past without saying hello." Thomas stood and shook Jake's hand, then introduced Emma. Understanding crossed her face. Hatonis had told her the whole story. "What brings you to London?" Thomas asked. Jake smiled genuinely. "I'm giving a talk at a youth conference about social media responsibility. It's part of the work I've been doing back home. I speak to young people about the dangers of seeking validation online and the importance of authentic connection." Thomas invited Jake to join them. Over coffee, Jake shared his journey. He had finished an associate degree in social work and was working with at-risk teenagers, helping them navigate social media pressures. He had started a nonprofit organization promoting digital kindness and helping cyberbullying victims. "That guard I humiliated saved my life," Jake told Emma. I was headed down a path that would have destroyed me. What happened, as painful as it was, forced me to look at myself and change course. Emma smiled warmly. It takes courage to change. Many people never do, even when they should. Jake showed them photos of his work pictures with teenagers at community centers. Positive messages from young people impacted by his talks. News articles about his nonprofit's efforts to create safer online spaces. I'm also getting married next month, Jake added shyly. Her name is Rachel. She's a social worker too. We met at a volunteer training program. Thomas felt genuinely happy. This was redemption in its truest form, not just apologizing, but fundamentally changing and dedicating your life to making amends. I think about what you told me all the time, Jake said seriously. About choosing who I want to be. About using whatever platform I have to spread kindness. I'm trying every day to live up to the grace you showed me. They talked for another hour. 3 people whose lives had been forever connected by one moment, sharing coffee like old friends. When Jake finally had to leave, he shook both their hands. Thank you for giving me a chance to show you who I've become. That means more to me than you know. After Jake left, Emma took Thomas's hand. That was remarkable. You changed that young man's entire life trajectory. Thomas shook his head. He changed his own life. I just showed him it was possible. Later that week, Thomas was invited to speak at Jake's conference. The event was held at a large central London venue filled with hundreds of young people. Jake introduced Thomas from the stage, telling their story honestly, holding nothing back about his own failings and the grace he had received. Thomas felt nervous as he looked out at the young faces, but he remembered why he was there. I'm not here to lecture you, Thomas began. I'm here to share what I've learned about dignity, forgiveness, and the power we all have to choose who we want to be. He spoke about his childhood, about watching his father come home from the mines exhausted but never defeated. He talked about choosing service over selfishness. He shared the water incident without anger or bitterness, using it to illustrate respect, humanity, and response to adversity. When Jake threw that water on me, I had a choice. I could respond with anger, revenge, or bitterness. Those would have been easy choices, but they would have changed me in ways I didn't want to be changed. Instead, I chose forgiveness. Not because Jake deserved it initially, but because I deserve the peace that comes from letting go of hatred. The audience listened in complete silence. And Jake had a choice too. He could have doubled down on his behavior, blamed others, made excuses, but he chose accountability. He chose change. He chose to become better. That's the most courageous thing anyone can do: admit you were wrong and commit to doing better. Thomas spoke about the responsibility that comes with online platforms, about the real people behind every screen, about the lasting impact of words and actions in the digital age. Every single one of you has power. Power to hurt or power to heal. Power to tear down or power to build up. Power to spread cruelty or spread kindness. You get to choose every single day how you use that power. When Thomas finished, the room erupted in applause. Young people stood, many with tears in their eyes. Jake stood at the side of the stage, clapping hard, his own face wet with tears. Afterward, dozens of young people came to speak with Thomas, sharing stories of being bullied online, of making mistakes, of trying to find their way in a world that often valued attention over authenticity. One teenage girl waited until everyone else had left. I've been cyberbullying someone at my school, she admitted quietly. After hearing you speak, I realize how wrong that is. I don't know how to fix it, but I want to. Thomas sat with her, and they talked about accountability, apology, and making amends. He gave her his email address for support as she tried to make things right. That evening, as Thomas and Emma walked along the Thames, he reflected on how far he had come from that humiliating day. Do you ever regret it? Emma asked. Everything that came after? Thomas thought carefully. No, I wouldn't have chosen it, but I'm grateful for what it taught me and for the good that came from it. It showed me that we can transform pain into purpose if we choose to. Thomas Mitchell continued serving as a Royal Guard for several more years before retiring with honors. He married Emma in a simple ceremony, and they had two children who grew up hearing stories about their fathers, service, and the importance of treating every person with dignity. Jake's nonprofit grew into a national organization, helping thousands of young people navigate online life with kindness and integrity. He became a sought-after speaker and author, never forgetting the lesson learned from a guard in a red uniform. Years later, when Thomas was an old man, his grandchildren asked about the water incident. Thomas smiled and pulled them close. That day taught me that how we respond to the worst in people can bring out the best in everyone. It taught me that forgiveness doesn't make you weak, it makes you free. And it taught me that every person, no matter what they've done, deserves a chance to become better. The story became more than just a viral moment. It became a testament to the power of grace, the possibility of redemption, and the truth that our worst moments don't have to define us, they can refine us if we let them.